Jamie, good morning. How's it going?
Good, Jake. How are you?
Man, I'm doing great. I've been I'm really excited for this.
Likewise.
You have acquired the number 3 all time typical whitetail in the world, and the number 1 Illinois typical. And this has kind of all came to revelation here the last would you say, well, really the last 2 months or so, but at least to the public.
I think it seems like Buckmasters initially broke the deer last fall, and I think a lot of people recognize that deer, especially the guys that are involved with sheds, and they pretty much knew, quote unquote, what deer that was. Mm-hmm. Usually the deer comes first, and maybe the sheds come out afterwards. In this case, it was reversed. The sheds were out for a long time, and then the deer got brought to light, and everyone recognized the deer based on the sheds. And I would say that for a while there, I think I got sort of quiet in the winter. Mm-hmm. And I think it seemed to maybe blow up's an overstatement, but I think the deer was at the Iowa Deer Classic, and I think that's where momentum, I guess you would say, would pick up.
Yeah, definitely.
And you know, the deer itself, the deer deserves recognition and credit, because it's like we were talking about before, it doesn't matter who owns it, whether Sam still owns it, a collector, or wherever it is. It's a heck of a deer.
It's truly exceptional. And before we get into it, there's a lot of things I want to talk about here today with you. But go ahead and introduce yourself, where you're from, and maybe even how you got into antler collecting, if you want to call yourself an antler collector, or maybe you're however you want to describe yourself. Go ahead.
Sure. So my name is James Martin. I live near Rochester, New York, and I've hunted my entire life. I actually don't hunt with a weapon anymore, but I hunt with a camera. I think, like everyone that probably watches you, most of us love hunting, and we love whitetail deer, and you're basically, it consumes you at times. And I think for me, the road I took to get to where I am now, and when I say that as the type of deer enthusiast I am, is, again, hunted for a long time, and I was bored probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and hopped on eBay with this random thought of wondering if there's any antlers on eBay. Uh-huh. And I bought an antler on eBay. So I paid, I don't know what it was, $20, $30 for this antler, and it showed up in a box at my door. And it was actually kind of odd, because when I opened that box, it was exciting. You know, and it wasn't a deer that I shot, or a shed off a deer that I hunted, or a shed that I found, but just having that antler in the box was kind of cool. Mm-hmm. And I guess not to make a long story long, but usually what happens with guys when they start to collect, and that was, I guess, the first step for me, they go down their own rabbit hole, and everyone ends up in a different place, I guess, or what they may or may not like. Like, some guys are shed guys, some guys are rack guys, some guys are both. Mm-hmm. Some guys like drops, some guys like typicals, or spread, mass, whatever it might be. Everyone has their own little niche for the most part. And, you know, for me, I stayed with sheds. I bought that first shed in the box, and I was a shed guy. And it's funny, to some extent, the shed guys and rack guys are like the Hatfields and McCoys in a way.
It's two different subcultures within a culture.
You know, that's somewhat true. It's somewhat true. There are a lot of guys that are strictly shed guys, and there's a lot of guys that are rack guys, and not too many guys overlap, but we all love antler. Sure. So I probably went a little bit of a tangent there.
So you mentioned you don't hunt with a weapon anymore, and only a camera. Why is that? Is it just, I mean, you're in New York, so that's, I mean, you're not in a Midwest state, so I understand New York is definitely not a lot of the other states in the country, but why is that? Because I know a lot of guys, I shouldn't say I know a lot, I know a handful of guys that have followed a similar path to that. I'm not there, but I want to hear how you got there.
I think, you know, as a lot of us hunt, we keep raising that bar, and whether it's age or the score of the deer you're trying to kill, we keep raising the bar. And for me, when I hunted, I I would do the same as most of us or most of the guys that watch you. I raised the bar. I'm not going to say that I was successful. I don't think I actually was the best hunter, to be honest with you. And when I started to collect, it actually started to help me understand what was really rare with antlers, whether it's a shed or a rack. And I think I started to understand that the deer that I was hunting, especially in New York, they were really special to me. So if you did have a deer that you hunted and you were successful, that deer is super special to most of us that are able to harvest that deer and you have it mounted and it's up on your wall. And all these deer that I shouldn't say all these deer, I didn't have a lot, but the deer that I did have mounted, they were all really special to me. But when I started collecting, they actually became a little bit less special. And the reason they became a little bit less special is, to me, they were priceless, as they should be. But when you start collecting, you start understanding what an antler might be worth or what a rack might be worth. And a lot of the stuff on my wall was poundage antler. And again, everyone's different. Everyone ends up on their own road and destination. But for me, I looked at my wall and I'm like, well, crap. When I die someday, what's my wife going to do with these? And they're going to be in a garage sale for like $40 or $50, or might end up in a dumpster. So I lost the motivation to hunt and actually kill with a weapon. And I was more motivated to start photographing deer in unhunted areas that obviously were a better caliber of deer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That I had a family friend once, like obviously someone that hunts has a bunch of shoulder mounts and everything else. He's like, so those are you're just going to die and they're going to go to an estate sale more than likely. And it was kind of the first time I ever crossed my mind as, dang, that is kind of a sobering thought. Like, they mean so much to us, right?
Yes.
But beyond that, the intrinsic value there for someone else, it's just not there. It's just, to your point, poundage antler, or it's just this or just that. But for us, it's the memory, which to me is worth it. But I definitely see where you're coming from.
The guys that are out there that still hunt, and there's still obviously still plenty of guys that do it. I was there and I understand why you do it. And again, to each their own. Everyone's a little bit different. To some people, their love is just wildlife photography, right? And they want to photograph a deer. And some people, their ultimate drive is just to go sit in a tree stand, to be outside in the outdoors and decompress. Mm-hmm. And some guys will, work really hard to kill their target animal. Then there's other guys that are out there that just basically want to collect antlers, the weirdos and nerds, probably like me.
Yeah. It's so you bought that first antler on eBay, and it sounds like something clicked there. And I mean, how did that evolve? Because you went from buying a $25 antler or $45 antler on eBay to buying one of the most, in my eyes, will end up being one of the most iconic whitetails in whitetail history. Like, when you look at the grand scheme of things, all of whitetail history, right? Like the millions of deer that have been shot, you just bought the number 3 all-time typical. That is exceptional. Like, I don't know if you'll ever have something that is more iconic in reality when you just look at the odds of everything. How did things progress?
That's a great question. I would say there's actually a lot of luck on how things progressed. I would say there was a lot of luck into acquiring the Sam Aiuppa Buck, in all honesty. I think again, for me personally, my progression somewhat hinged on the other guys that I got to know more in the antler collecting industry. And I think they, just from talking to them and them sharing their wisdom, I think in my opinion, it probably helped shorten the learning curve a little bit. Again, I'm not claiming I know everything about collecting, because I definitely don't. I feel like you're always learning. Probably will always learn until you're probably 6 feet under, to be honest with you, about whether you're hunting deer or about collecting antlers. But I think my progression from the eBay purchase, probably like anyone else, right? You keep raising that bar. So I got this eBay shed and I loved it and bought a bigger one at some point on eBay. Social media has a bunch of antler groups, and there's a bunch of antler fanatics in there. Not so much just hunting groups, but more like collecting groups, mostly sheds. I think the shed end of things is greatly promoted. There's a North American Shed Antler Hunters Club, which does a great job of keeping records.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think they do a really good job of promoting the shed part of things. So sticking with that, so I don't I'm good at going on tangents, so I apologize. I got to know some of the higher profile collectors for sheds, and there's quite a few of them. Probably the two most I can think of would be Matt Beard and Mike Shruis. Those two guys are the kings of the shed collecting world, and good guys as well. Tons of knowledge about deer and sheds. So started to acquire some better pieces along the way, again, kind of moving up the scale. And a lot of the best pieces in the world are probably with those two guys. Those two guys have tremendous shed antler collections. They're also co-owners of the Shed Club as well. So if you ever go to one of the shows, you get to see the Shed Club display.
They always have something in the trophy room in the Iowa Deer Classic, right? Is that the same club there?
Correct. So they usually have like this black shelved tables, if you will, and they'll have all their sheds laid out. And it's basically, there's 4 of them that own the sheds there. Most of them are Mike and Matt's. It doesn't get any better. That's the best of the best in the world for whitetail deer sheds. So moved up, going back to how I got to racks, I guess. It's an interesting question. I actually transitioned into racks from sheds not too long ago, and it was by total accident. There was a collector, Keith Snyder, actually someone that we're getting.
Grips, yeah.
Yes, we're actually getting into some nice deep personal information here, but I can divulge this. So Keith owns a tremendous set of sheds in his collection, and they're called the General, and they're from Nebraska. And I'm a shed guy, and so they're highly sought after, of course. And again, going back to how I transitioned into racks, and I actually bought a rack to trade or potentially trade for the General. It might not do the deal, but I tried anyways. So I bought this rack, and it was almost like that first shed on eBay when I bought the rack and actually looked at it, I fell in love to a point where I never thought that I would, as a shed guy, you just prefer sheds, and racks to you a lot of guys aren't even interested in a rack, but some of them dabble.
Why is that?
It's a great question. I think a lot of the times, a lot of guys like to be able to hold. The sheds are a little bit easier to hold, for a rack, especially if it's mounted, it's kind of big and clumsy, and you almost have to hang it on the wall to look at it, which is fine. So I think a lot of guys like to actually pick up the sheds and hold them. A lot of guys say fondle their sheds. It doesn't sound right, but you know what I mean.
Right.
And so I think that's part of it. And I also think that, again, I think the shed part of things is very well marketed. And I think a lot of guys gravitate to it, especially on Facebook. Again, I bought that shed on eBay and looked for antler groups on Facebook, and it's littered with shed groups. And like the rack part of things, in all honesty, and I'm over there now, but the rack part of things is kind of dead, unfortunately. A lot of your collectors, the shed world used to be very busy. If you go back 10, 15, 20 plus years ago, and there's guys that can probably comment about this that know much more than I do, there were quite a few rack collectors, and the rack world was buzzing, and the shed world was pretty dead.
So it goes in waves.
It seems like it, and then back then too, like Larry Huffman and Dick Idle, they were big collectors, big promoters. And again, this is kind of before social media was big, and a lot of the buzz was around racks. Mm-hmm. But now the opposite's true. Now most of the attention is on sheds. And I probably went down a dead end road there a little bit with that, but to bounce back, going back to Keith and getting this rack, I fell in love with this rack, and ever since buying that one rack to potentially trade to Keith.
Can you say what rack you bought that would, because I'm thinking the General, right? Most iconic set of sheds of all time, that has to be a pretty big rack in order to make a trade even make sense.
Sure. So it was, and some of you guys out there may know it. It was the Brian Stevens buck.
Okay.
And there's a collector, as far as I'm concerned, just a tremendous, iconic collector. His name's Gail Supp. And Gail Supp has had, number one, amazing guy. Number two, just an amazing collector as well. He's had some tremendous pieces over the years. And actually his first collection that he sold to Bass Pro is a good chunk of Bass Pro's collection, in all honesty. Mm-hmm. So I acquired the Brian Stevens buck, and I feel very grateful that he was willing to pass it on to me from him. And for the most part, I never got to trying to work a deal with Keith on the general with the Brian Stevens. But after buying the Brian Stevens, that's where I started to spend more time trying to acquire racks versus sheds.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So obviously, could you share how negotiations went on that? Because I'm thinking the general, that'd be really, really, really hard to acquire, right?
I can tell you that I probably it'd be funny to be a freeway with Keith on this one, but I probably failed miserably trying to get the generals from him, and we tried to. I shouldn't say we; it was mostly me. I tried to propose a couple deals to him. And I didn't obviously get anywhere close probably to where he wanted to be, which is fine.
Yeah. So okay. So how many racks do you have right now that are in your collection that would you say are top tier?
That's a good question. I'm not sure actually. If I had to guess, and I think top tier, I think to everyone's probably a little bit different because it could be based on gross score, net score. It could be based on ranking. Again, it could be based on personal preferences. I probably have, I would say 6 to 8 solid racks in my collection right at this point. And unfortunately, it's when you like good antlers, whether it's sheds or racks, like we were talking about before a little bit, it's it can be a semi-expensive sport. So you have to be a little bit resourceful. And
how do you, obviously everyone has their passion, right? Everyone has what they spend their discretionary funds on. I think everyone does, right?
Yes.
And so, and I also I was not at the cribs with Keith Snyder, but I'm just thinking how did he acquire all these? And my guess is that it's a lot of horse trading, a lot of buying and selling or trading or whatever the case may be. Is that an accurate assumption?
I'll lump Keith in with me. We're probably both pretty, I don't think either one of us is rich by any means. There's guys out there that do collect that probably have
this write the check.
Yeah, that really have really deep pockets and they can pretty much do what they want. And there's guys out there that need to be a little creative. And I would imagine, I won't speak for him, but my guess is Keith's probably creative. I'm creative as well. Luckily for me, I had a pretty good shed collection, and I've actually sold a large portion of my shed collection to basically trade for racks, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you, so for someone that's I get the collection because to me, it's you're buying a piece of whitetail history, right? And you get to preserve that. You get to preserve the story. It's not in a basement for 20 some years, right? It gets the respect that it deserves, is kind of what you mentioned. Is that what the driving factor is, or is it just simply being an antler nut? Or is it a balance between the two?
It's definitely a balance between the two. I would be lying if I said that there was no part of you that when you collect a piece, it makes you feel you're almost an addict, if you will. And that's probably a bad comparison, but it doesn't make you feel good. Sure it does. I can't deny that. I think a lot of the guys that are pretty serious about it, though, I think it's the other part as well, is some of the pieces that you may acquire are historical pieces, or maybe they will be historical pieces.
Right.
Because of their importance, again, whether it's ranking or score or something to that effect. So it's definitely a combination. It's definitely a combination of both. The one thing I think some people probably don't realize, even some collectors themselves, is, in a way, again, just an opinion, the collecting is relatively important. I think there's certain people out there, and again, not wrong or right to feel this way, that are against the whole collecting part of it. But in a way, the collecting does bring some of these heads to light, and does shine a spotlight on them. For example, if you ask any hunter, a lot of hunters actually, it's funny, my some of my family hunts, I have friends that hunt, but if you say, hey, do you know the Jordan buck? Some will say yes, and some will say no. Not everyone knows it. It's probably one of the most iconic whitetails ever. And the reason, though, that some of the hunters know it and it's part of whitetail history is actually from collectors that have owned it.
Yeah.
So to some extent, the collecting part, in my opinion, is somewhat important, especially for whitetail history.
Hmm. There's two parallels I've noticed when it comes to iconic whitetails. The first one being is like the Jordan buck, like it was MIA for however long. The Illinois roadkill buck was in a bar forever, and they like got tracked down. The deer you just bought was in the basement for 20 some years, and so like there's almost like, I don't know if that builds up the story or it makes it more unique, but or the hole in the horn buck, right? Like it was in the underworld for a very long time, and it seems like those are the ones that just surge into the limelight versus, just a ginormous deer that gets shot and it's fresh in our memory. Like, do you think there's anything to that? Because I feel like a lot of this is psychology and like this the excitement around it. Like, oh my gosh, it was gone forever, and now here it is. Here's the story.
I think that definitely plays a part in any deer that is the segue. It basically ends up in the spotlight as if it was gone for a while. When I say gone, like it was discovered. I guess, like you said, the Jordan buck that was known, but that disappeared for a while. Long story to that one. It's a good one. If you don't know it, look it up. It's a really good story behind the Jordan buck. It's almost amazing that he ended up with it.
Yeah.
The hole in the horn was in a bar in Ohio for many years before it was discovered. And then Dick Idle basically acquired it from the barn, from what I remember. I think Dick Idle was the first person that acquired it. With the Sam Aiuppa Buck, it was in his basement, ironically, for 32 years. And again, it's kind of by luck in a way it came to light, because again, there was an electrician that went in his basement that had some knowledge of deer and antler, and there it was, and he knew he was looking at something pretty special.
Mm-hmm. Crazy. Yeah. And the other parallel I've noticed is a lot of the most iconic deer are the stories of a guy that just went out and had no clue the deer existed and was successful. Like, and that's even in most common history, even in the world of trail cameras, right? Like people know about the deer, and it seems like the guys that know about the deer are doing everything they possibly can to potentially kill that deer. It ends up getting shot by someone that didn't have a clue it was there and shooting it. And that's the same deal with the buck that you bought. Obviously, it was a different time in 91, but do you think that is also easier to resonate to the general population? Like, because it's almost like the lottery, like, oh, it could happen to me. It happened to so-and-so, so-and-so. So like, you just go down the giant list of deer, like some of the top deer, right? Do you think that plays a factor into how these deer resonate with more people versus the guy that owns a large track, followed the deer for 5 years and shot, one of the top end deer of all time?
I think it definitely could play a part. I think there's a lot of guys out there. I know I used to be one of those guys that would hunt and you didn't know what was out there, whether you chose not to, or you just maybe didn't do the proper scouting. I shouldn't say proper, but you didn't do your due diligence with scouting to know what kind of inventory you had out there for bucks. And I think those people identify with that a little bit more, of someone getting lucky, if you will, and shooting a world-class deer versus someone maybe that puts in the time and has tons of history, which happens sometimes, right? I think in today's day and age, like you alluded to with technology, I think the percentage has probably gone up on hunters that have history and they know about the deer being in the area. They're hunting a certain deer.
Mm-hmm. I still feel like even if we go in most recent history, like the C.J. Alexander buck didn't know existed. The Dustin Huff buck didn't know existed. And like those are some of the top typical bucks here in the last, short time. Obviously times have changed, but like those are two examples, right? Where it's like they didn't know existed and they shot them. And I think that resonates with the overall population of whitetail hunting.
I would agree. I think Dustin Huff's story is pretty cool. He was just like, I think he was out looking for just a 130 class deer, and then here comes the number one typical in the U.S. and he gets it. So that's an amazing story.
Yeah, for sure. So one other question on this is, like, I have to imagine, obviously there's value to these. How do you have an insurance policy on this? Like, what's that conversation like with your insurance agent? Like, hey, I want to get a balloon policy on these antlers. They're like, they're worth what? What is that like?
What is it? That's a great question. So personally, I have an umbrella that covers my antlers, if you will. I'm sure my agency they probably think I'm nuts. I think for the most part, when you tell, it doesn't matter if it's your insurance agent, your friends or family, that you're going to spend X amount of dollars on a certain deer or shed, I think they think you're nuts. There's a lot of guys out there they'll think $1,000 for an antler is absolutely crazy, and it's really not. But that's also going back to what you asked. Yeah, the insurance part of it's really odd because it's a really gray area, because how do you put a value on those items?
The Mona Lisa or whatever it is, right?
They're irreplaceable. Each and every one of them, they're like a snowflake. Every snowflake's different. With deer, same thing with antler. Every single one of them's different. So in a way, they're irreplaceable. You've heard of deer in the past. They've been stolen. Certain deer have burned in fires. And there's almost a lot of times there's no money that can replace it. I think for a lot of guys that hunt, if they had a fire at their house and they lost their collection of deer they've killed, to them, they lost the world probably, because a lot of those deer are irreplaceable.
Yeah. Yeah.
A little bit different with collecting versus hunting, but the same concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I want to dive into the buck you bought. I remember seeing this deer. I think I follow a Facebook page called like the 200 inch Net Typical Club. And I remember seeing those sheds. And so I live in Illinois. I was actually in LaSalle County 2 days ago. So if that shows anything. And I remember seeing this deer on Facebook and with those ginormous brow tines, the sheds of it. And I'm thinking, like, how has no one, like, what's the scoop here? And like, I remember just like, it was all hearsay in that thread when I read it. And I wasn't very active in it, but every now and then to come on my feed and I'd look at it. But I want to hear like the full revelation of like identification that this deer existed to you driving back in your truck with that deer in your back seat or maybe front seat buckled in. Like, I want to hear the full story.
It's actually not that exciting, the story. So Buckmasters broke it.
Mm-hmm.
At some point after they broke it, I got some intel on where it was, and after getting that, I reached out to. It was good intel, of course, because the name I got was Sam Aiuppa. And once I called him, I usually, as a collector, when you call someone out of the blue, it's a little bit, I don't know, it can be odd for people, for someone to call them and say, right. Yeah, you call some person, and a lot of people that own sheds or racks, and they don't expect someone to call to buy them. Mm-hmm. And he I don't think he had an idea, to be honest with you. And
were you the first collector to track him down?
Yes, I was. Which, by the way, that's, if you're collecting, that helps. If you're the first one, and sometimes if maybe you're the only one during negotiations and pickup, it also helps, by the way. Mm-hmm. If you have other people in the mix, which happens a lot of times, it can get interesting.
Bidding war.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does happen. So I just called Sam and asked him if he'd be interested in selling his rack. And then he asked me what I thought the value would be. And I said, well, based on numbers I see from Buckmasters, which every score is different, every organization is different. But you have something to go on, there's a baseline to go on there. And I said, based on those numbers, this would be my range. And he basically said, if you'd be on the higher end of that range, I probably would do it. Mm-hmm. And I think I said something like, what are you doing tomorrow? And he basically, I forget if I went out the next day or the 2 days later, but it was close after that phone call, and stopped out there and looked at it. And when I saw it, he had it on his dining room table. And when I saw it, it looked big to me. And I was trying to do some quick math in my head, and I'm in my head before going out, based on Buckmaster's numbers, it was going to net around 205. Mel Johnson is 204 and change. So if it did that 205, it beats Mel, which is a long-standing state record.
Yeah,
which is pretty cool. And again, I did some measurements, and I'm like, this deer is it's gonna do well, and I think it's gonna go north of 205. Wasn't sure, but I thought so. Told Sam I would agree to the upper end of my range. Left his house with the deer, and Dave Boland was nice enough to drive from his place to meet me near Chicago. So I probably 30 minutes after I walked out of his house with the deer, Dave Boland's scoring it. Mm-hmm. I think he knew based on our conversation it could be something pretty special. And then he came up with 2077 net, 207.78. I'm sorry. And, you know, I think a lot of guys, like if I talk to my dad or my brother and I say these numbers, it probably, to most people, it's not going to mean a ton. And I understand that. You know, when you collect and you hear 207.7 net typical, it means a lot. It's a big number. Once you get to net 200, like those deer are super rare. And every eighth of an inch over 200 really is a big jump, let alone every inch. Mm-hmm. You know, so 207.7 basically edges out the Jordan for number 3. Going back to Dave Boland, I mean, probably quite a few people that might watch this know Dave Boland. Dave Boland's been scoring for most of his life, and he's just a tremendous, tremendous individual. Very selfless with his time. For him to do that, to go there and score that deer almost at the drop of a hat, and he'll do that for anyone. Like he's an amazing man. He's definitely, you know, he's a huge part of the Boon and Crockett organization for scoring racks, and he's a tremendous part of the North American Shed Hunters Club as well. So, you know, he scored it 207.7, and then there's a process that it has to get entered. I've actually personally never entered a head into Boon and Crockett until the Sam Aiuppa Buck. And so most of the deer that I've acquired already had a score attached to them, and they were already entered. So you don't get them rescored again. Once they're entered, that's it. Boon and Crockett, I was impressed. I wasn't sure how that would work. They had a ton of questions. They want to make sure that what they're entering is 100% legit. They were able to find that Sam even had a hunting license from that year for deer. Wow. Which is, you know, if he didn't, say he didn't have a hunting license for deer back when he killed it, then obviously that's a red flag. Yeah. So, you know, they asked me a ton of questions, which a lot of the questions I had to forward to Sam, and Sam had to answer them. So they did their due diligence, and it probably took, you know, I think it took maybe 3 months for it to be finally accepted. It's pending a panel to score it, but it's initially accepted. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because even like Boone and Crockett's running a Facebook ad with the story right now to the article, and like reading those comments, it bugs me that when people see a big deer like this and they're like, "Oh, it's in the basement for 30 years, it was poached," or like this or that, and it's like whitetail hunting, or maybe hunting in general, is the only thing that you're guilty until proven innocent, which bugs me, honestly. And so, I mean, what was like to Sam, obviously, like what was his relationship with this deer? Was it because he's a bird hunter from the article I read? Like he was pheasant hunting that morning and went out and shot this deer with an 870.
He is predominantly, probably to this day, still like a trap wing shooter. I think after Buckmaster scored it and they told him it was going to be number 1 in they have different categories than Boone and Crockett. I believe it's in their typical category. I think it's like typical shotgun is the category it's in for Boone and Crockett, but it's not, or Boone and Crockett, I'm sorry, for Buckmasters. And it's number 1 there. So I think he knew he had something special at that point. Before that, I mean, probably not, most likely not. I never got the impression that he thought that he had something that was the state record since 91. Mm-hmm. And I get the impression he had no idea that he had the world record for 2 years. Because when this deer was killed, it was 2 years prior to Milo. So this would have been the James Jordan. Right. Yeah. And it would have been the world record, which, you know, it's pretty cool little side fact, I guess. Yeah. So the world record was just sitting in his basement.
I didn't even think of that. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. It was the world record for a short stint. Yeah. Which is crazy. It's also crazy to me that like someone that didn't know, like, hey, this might be the world record, or like, hey, like it's crazy that I could just fly under the radar for that long a period of time. When, I mean, it's crazy.
You know what's really neat, and we were talking about deer that have been I guess not brought to light till later or lost or whatever it might be. So for a long time, everyone knew the Albring Sheds. And when you look at the picture on the Boone and Crockett post that they had, there's a picture of a single on top which is a very big 5-point. Matt Beard owns that. There's a set of sheds that's mounted. Got some people confused with the mounted set of sheds in the middle. Those are known as the Albring Sheds, and Matt Beard also owns those. And everyone knew that was the same deer, that single above and the set of sheds below. Again, for the set of sheds, I think were brought to light in the 90s. So they've been out there for,
wow,
the better part of 30 years, give or take. But to have the deer all of a sudden pop up, because you really think a lot of times what happens if there's no kill deer to go with the sheds, there's a lot of things that can happen. Maybe the deer got older, went downhill, almost became unrecognizable from its antlers when it was peaked. Maybe it shed its antlers and got killed after that somehow or died. That's always a possibility. Or maybe someone killed it and it was just buried. That doesn't happen a lot, but especially with something that would be significant. But in this case, this is what happened. The deer was just never brought to light for that entire time. And then it pops out and the sheds go with it. Again, kind of a side note, but makes it a little bit more cool.
Yeah. Pieces it all together. Do you have any, do you think you could get the sheds, or do you think do you think, I think it'd be so much more unique if all that was pieced together to one person.
It's funny. I've always wanted to put together a really good rack with the sheds from the deer. And it seemed like in the past that I've always missed that opportunity if it's been there. Like, for example, another rack that I own now, I used to have a shed from it, but I sold the shed and then I had the rack later. So it's kind of like whack-a-mole there. With the Albring set and the single, it's probably not likely. Usually when antlers are in Matt Beard's collection, we call it the black hole. Usually they go in and they don't come out. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all, but that's Matt's a pure collector.
Uh-huh.
And he doesn't let much stuff go. So those will probably be there for quite a while.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. So that's just, it's truly fascinating because and the brow tines of this deer were insane. Do you know what the shed, the match set, the shed, what did those tape out to? Obviously we don't know the inside spread, but
you're challenging me a little bit with stats. I believe the one side I know is over 100 on the left side, and I think it's a 6-point. And on the right side, I believe it's a 5, and I think that is around 96. Don't quote me on that. That's just going off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
So that set ranks, I believe it's top 5 for typical sets for the Shed Club.
Wow. So obviously we don't know for sure, but the set you have, would that have netted higher? Would those sheds netted 200, do you think, with those deductions? I mean, obviously we don't know the inside spread, but. So say that one more time. So let's say the one side's a 100-inch, the other side's 96, and then throw in the spread there. Oh, I see what you're saying. Do you think it would have netted higher than when it was killed, or do you think it would have netted less? Oh, it would have netted, the sheds would have netted less. Okay. Wow. Yeah. Go ahead. I was going to say, I want to say they're in the shed book for around, they're like 180-ish. So if you gave it the proper spread on the sheds, and again, don't hold me to those numbers, I just think I'm in the ballpark. I believe if you gave it like a 20-inch spread, this year's 20 7/8, the sheds probably would net around 200, maybe a little bit more. Mm-hmm. The nice thing about the sheds is they're clean. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a non-typical on the sheds, and if there is, it's very minute, where the kill deer has 9 inches of non-typical. Mm-hmm. Jeez, crazy. Yeah. It's truly fascinating. And I had another thought here. It's escaped me now, but I mean, what's next for you? It's like, how do you? The Illinois roadkill, the Hansen buck, like what? It's probably, and I say this jokingly, it's all downhill from here. Yeah. What's next for me? That's a great question. I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't know. I think with collecting, I like to keep it fun and light, and I will take opportunities as they come. So at this point, if I could buy
if I could buy one good head a year or one good piece a year, like that's, I think what I would want to do is just one really good quality piece. Mm-hmm. What piece that is, I have no idea at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. It still blows my mind that this was the world record for a short time.
You know, this deer is, from a number standpoint, I love numbers, and I have my own business, and I think people, maybe they have their own business, understand like the love for numbers, especially with, you know, understanding what you need to do as a business with your numerics. But with a hobby that involves numbers that determines rarity, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So this deer has tremendous numbers. There's so many stats with it that are pretty mind blowing. The G1 through the G4, it's the most inches of any deer. And if I'm wrong, man, someone comment and correct me, but I believe it has the most inches from G1 to G4.
Those G1s help a little bit.
Just a little bit. So Boon and Crockett, it's a little confusing. So they score it as a 5x5. Mm-hmm. When you have an odd point on one side, it doesn't get deducted. It just almost doesn't get, I guess I do deduct it in a way, because when they do their side-to-side difference, they deduct the one side. So I don't want to misspeak there. It does get a little confusing, the whole measuring system. It's not super complicated, but even collectors sometimes get a little bit, at least I do, confused, and sometimes how you explain it might be off. They score it as a 5x5, the way that is. That net score does not include that G5 on the right. It's the biggest grossing 5x5 frame, biggest netting 5x5 frame. It's the biggest 6x5 frame out there. It obviously is it's ranked number 3 in the world at this point. I'll get back to that in a minute. It's number 1 for Illinois. It beats the Mel Johnson, which was a long-standing state record, which is pretty neat. Now, what's pretty cool is, from my understanding, and hopefully during this whole interview I don't misspeak about anything. I'm trying to best my ability to remember all the facts correctly. I believe the Huff buck and this buck are going to be paneled together later in 25. So that might be interesting.
Yeah.
Because they're really, I can say they're not far off. It is pretty far. You get over 200, every inch is huge. Huff is 211 and change, and this one's almost 208, 2077. Mm-hmm. So not going to say that anything's going to change, but with panel scoring, you never know.
Yeah, that's oh, even we had Tom, last name Thomas, on the show here. He shot one of the giant bucks in Ohio this past year, and there was a lot of question of like how it scored what it did, and I don't know. It's always just interesting to see like how the Boon and Crockett decides what something scores, and it seems that there's some ambiguity there, or at least room for contention on sometimes what they come up with. What is your thoughts on that as an antler collector?
Man, that's a great question. That's $1 million question, actually, is what is typical and what's not typical. And some of the biggest debates in antler have come from that topic, right?
All of them, yeah.
Look at the Johnny King buck, for example. That's the world record, but Boon and Crockett decided that right G3, if it was typical, would be a right G3, isn't a G3. Not going to get into that. But Buckmasters and Boon and Crockett are very different with what they determine is typical. I would say, obviously, Boon and Crockett's more picky about it than Buckmasters. You know, as a collector, most collectors follow the Boon and Crockett system. And maybe that's just because it's an older system and they follow it to determine ranking or rarity. Mm-hmm. I can't fault. In the Boon and Crockett article that I read, it made it sound like it was taken out of context in a way when it says something about only score that matters is Boon and Crockett. From a collecting standpoint, that's generally true. In the real life, that's obviously not true, right? There's different scoring systems out there. Boon and Crockett's just more picky on typical. Buckmasters is a little bit more lenient on what is or isn't typical. I can't sit here and say that either organization or a score is right or wrong, because I think a lot of times there's a gray area to what is typical, and it really determines on the interpretation of the rules for each club.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know anything about card collecting, but you have like a PSA 10, and then you have the other version of card scoring. It almost seems like there's a parallel there with Boon and Crockett and Buckmaster. Like the PSA 10 is the gold standard, and it almost seems like it's very similar to that.
I would say that's a great analysis. Same thing with sheds. The dominant's a wrong word. The predominant, I guess, club would be the North American Shed Hunters Club. If someone's going to get a shed scored to get official number to determine rarity or value or whatever it might be, it's going to be the Shed Club. For racks at this point, all the collectors that I would know, or if I ask them, they're going to use Boon and Crockett.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's no knock. That's absolutely no knock on Buckmasters whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe someday down the road, maybe that, you never know. Maybe that changes. Obviously, Boon and Crockett's been around for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you know how many? I remember reading this somewhere, and maybe it just came into my brain, and I didn't read it anywhere. I made it up. But do you know how many net 200-inch typicals are recorded?
I believe, off the top of my head, don't hold me to it. I mean, I'll bet you an expensive dinner on it. I think there's 23, I think.
Okay, I thought it was 20-something, so that makes me feel better.
Yeah, I believe there's, in Boon and Crockett's record books, I believe there's 23 net 200-inch typicals.
Which just shows the rarity
of
a net 200.
You are correct. Super rare. Absolutely. I mean, that's once in probably a million lifetimes for a hunter to kill a deer like that. What's even more rare, though, is a net 300. There's only 8 net 300s, and 2 of them are found dead. 6 of them are hunter kills. So there's only 6 hunter kills net 300s, and there's 23 net 200s that were killed by hunters.
Wow.
So net 200, super special. And I think people gravitate to typical versus non for various reasons. But from a rarity standpoint, the net 300 is basically 2/3 more rare, if you will.
Yeah.
There's only a third of them.
But I mean, we've done a bunch of videos on YouTube of like we've done videos on a lot of the deer that we're talking about here today. And the typicals have the most amount of views and interest. And why do you think that is? It seems like typicals, obviously the non-typicals are more rare, right? But people gravitate towards, is it just because the human eye likes symmetry? Or?
Absolutely. It's got to be the pure beauty. It's probably a cross between I think for a lot of guys, it's visible eye appeal, or the beauty would be a big part of it. And I think to other people, like once you dig a little deeper, the rarity of it. Because when you think about a deer that grows a lot of inches and it grows it almost perfectly without trash, especially as it gets older, which typically when deer get older, they seem to pump out more trash. And that's what you need. You usually need an older deer to pump out a big frame that's going to score that well. That's probably, those two things are probably the biggest draws based on the eye appeal and rarity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's nothing more beautiful than a big typical. I think almost, there's a lot of guys out there. There's some guys that would disagree that have, and no one's right or wrong, that would like drop tines or like trash or tons of trash on something. But you're right, though. People love a big typical.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point you bring up, like deer throwing more trash as they get older. Like the common debate was the Hansen buck wasn't really that old. And they're like, what could you imagine what he would have been, a year or two later? And then at that point, he might have scored more, but he might not have been the world record.
You're very right. If you look at the deer that I have, the Sam Aiuppa Buck, the sheds of the year before, they're cleaner than this deer. This deer pumped out 9 inches of non-typical, which to a lot of deer from a score standpoint, the rack's still the rack, but from a score standpoint, usually non-typical will take out a deer in regards to score. So if the deer lived another year, probably a good chance it would have gone to a lower score.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right, actually, to that, which non-typical will definitely, as they get older, could hurt if you're looking for that net score, which again, a lot of guys don't care
Nets
care
are for
about
fish,
that. Nets are for fish. Yeah. If I hunted, I'd still say the same thing. Nets don't matter when you hunt for the most part. Mm-hmm. I think nets apply to a certain small group of people. And
the crown jewel of whitetails.
Yes, and I think, again, for hunters, if hunters say nets are for fish, I think they're right. That's true. again, I think the net score determines ultimate rarity, and who's looking for ultimate rarity? Usually like whitetail historians or collectors.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think, obviously, like art, right? Art can appreciate over a long period of time. Obviously, you're investing a lot into this, and you're investing this out of passion. But do you think 30 years from now, 50 years from now, that these would continue to appreciate to where you're like, okay, you can tell your wife, okay, it was a good investment?
That might be a tall order to tell my wife it's a good investment. Actually, no, she's pretty cool. She's very respectful of my interests and hobbies, which there's not many. You would think anything you buy within reason would appreciate in time, just for general inflation reasons. As it pertains to antler, it's different, actually. Again, there's like two segments. You have sheds and racks. From my point of view, sheds are awesome right now. They're doing really good. And I actually don't think sheds will actually go up more value in the near future, because I think they're kind of at their top end right now. Again, just an opinion. Over time, 5-10 years down the road, may they start going up again? Probably. Racks, my opinion, I think racks are semi-depressed right now. And the reason they're semi-depressed is, again, there's less interest. There's less guys collecting racks. If I look around the country, the guys actively buying racks, you can probably count them. And when I say racks, I'm not talking about something that would be more common. I guess you'd say your upper level racks. You could probably count on one hand the active buyers, which is amazing to me. There should be more. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't take many more guys buying racks for them to
drive the market.
Yeah, to drive the market. Like right now, again, there's some drive, but it's pretty quiet on the rack side of things.
Mm-hmm. Because it's crazy to me that you were the first phone call to buy this thing, and I think that shows that you can count on one hand. Because and I don't know anything about antler collecting, right? I just think it's cool, but it seems like there's just a whole underworld to that niche, if you will. Like it just seems like it's a subculture that is very small and also very tight knit, which could also cause issues or friction or whatever. Like if there's 4 guys going after the same exact thing all the time, like you're mm-hmm. probably not gonna be best friends with all of them, right? Like because you're still kind of semi competing for the same piece.
It's funny, you don't collect, but you sound like you do, because that was a perfect analysis of collecting. The shed end of things, there's always going to be a bidding war if people know about a piece, and a lot of times people do know about a piece. The rack end of things, it's definitely more quiet. Can there be competition? I'm sure there can be. I haven't ran into it directly yet, but I'm sure I will at some point. The other thing too about collecting is it seems like, and this is like a general analysis, it seems like everyone's in their own corner. Usually you don't have a group of 3, 4, or 5 guys that are tight and loyal to each other. They're all kind of in their own corner, mm-hmm. which is, it's in a way, I wish it wasn't that way, but it's probably just the way it's going to be, because it's competitive. And I think with anything that's competitive, other things come with it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to give you a hard hypothetical, and feel free to answer it. Feel free to defer.
Sure.
I'm giving you a blank check.
Okay.
And you can buy whatever rack you want. What deer are you selecting, and what are you writing on the check?
Oh wow, that's a really good question. It's a good question. Is it a shed or a rack, or is it anything?
We'll do rack. I think okay. I know what shed you want, so I don't want to muddy your negotiations with Keith here.
I'll make it very. It's a good question, but it's an easy one to answer. I could tell you, if it was non-typical for a rack, it would be the hole in the horn. If it was typical for a rack, it would be the Jordan for me. Mm-hmm. And I would say that check would be, it would be north of 100. Mm-hmm. Can I afford that? No, but that's where it should be.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. So, man, yeah, it's fun. It's fun to me because it's just such an interesting subculture.
And the value for sheds or racks is definitely open to interpretation, because you could ask 10 collectors a value of a certain piece and you'll probably get close to 10 different answers.
Do you ever foresee, because I feel like an auction, right? An auction is typically the best way to find a true value. Do you ever see a day where a collection or there's like an annual auction for sheds and racks and all the collectors are there and it's bidding? I feel like that would democratize this entire space, because now it's worth whatever someone's willing to take to sell it. That's what it's worth, right? Whatever you're willing to pay and whatever someone's willing to let it go for, that's what it's worth. But an auction setting, I think, would bring all of this to light, like, because that would be everything to really like speed up this entire space.
Well, it's funny you say that, because on social media, on Facebook, there is an auction group for antler.
Okay.
So in one facet, it does take place, and it takes place about every day. There's stuff on there. Once a year in Maquoketa, Iowa, there's actually an antler auction where a variety of stuff shows up. You have anything from farm antler, and every once in a while you'll see a pretty good piece will show up there. So sometimes you get to see the fireworks of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen that often, because a lot of times the best pieces in the world are pretty locked up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there is nothing more exciting than when a good piece goes to auction, in my opinion.
What's a whitetail that I would possibly know that has gone to auction? Because I feel like it's all behind closed doors, and it's like full collections and everything else.
That's all. And you're asking some really good questions, and you're actually challenging my memory. My memory sometimes stinks. So not too long ago, another collector passed away. Bredzel lived in Pennsylvania, and his wife had several heads go to auction, and I think there were several famous deer. The Ben Knisley buck from Minnesota. Have you heard of that one at all?
No, I'm gonna Google it though.
Go ahead. That one was up for auction. It was a really interesting auction too. It was definitely an unorthodox auction. It's too bad you couldn't see what was going on. It was more of a, I forget what they call it. Skip it. It's slipping my mind at the moment. But basically, you can see other people's bids or hear them. You just submitted a bid, and you get a phone call if you won. Mm-hmm. The Neil Morin buck, which is from Canada, I believe that's Canada's largest scoring non-typical. That was in that auction. Hattie Peck is a huge buck from Iowa. That was also in the auction. Mm-hmm. And there are some other ones that are probably lesser known, and maybe I'm forgetting one that would be better known, like those three. But those are three tremendous heads that were in an auction not too long ago.
Did Keith? I just Googled it. Did Keith end up buying the Ben Knisley buck?
He did not.
Okay.
I think from talking to him back then, I remember that he wanted it, but I don't believe that's in his collection. Mm-hmm. I feel like gosh, again, my memory's not serving me correctly right now, but I feel like Keith won something in that auction, but I forget what it was.
Mm-hmm. And so I just typed in, and obviously there's a antler by claws, and so like there's replicas that you can buy. Is that something that's a viable revenue stream? Like if I wanted a replica of this deer, is that something that you do, or is it something that you try to protect the value of it by not having replicas out there? Because it's like you're allowing print of a piece of art, or it's like there's the original and then there's 200 prints.
Good question. My knee-jerk reaction is I don't think it affects value that much, but I will say also sometimes it feels advantageous to not have a mold for something that you own, mm-hmm. whether it's a shed or rack, that there's not replicas out there. But usually those two are going to generally attract different people. So I'm not going to say that I'm right, but I would guess that it probably doesn't affect the value much of whatever piece is being molded and replicated to have replicas out there of a certain piece. Mm-hmm. You've probably been to his website. That's a tremendous website. Tons of the most amazing whitetails ever killed or found And you can, for obviously a fraction of the cost of what the real one would be, you can get a replica, which looks just like the real thing.
Mm-hmm. Would you, so like, would you have to provide permission for them to allow to make a replica, or can they just look at the measurements and look at the pictures and do it?
So usually what happens is there's rights to a mold, and usually what happens is the original person, it could be the hunter, sometimes it could be a collector, will, I guess, forego those rights and allow someone like Klaus to replicate. How does that work when the piece basically transfers to someone else? I'm actually not sure what happens at that point. I don't know if that new owner could actually say, I don't want you to replicate it, or because the original, whether it's the hunter or the collector, says it's okay. I don't know how that carries over. It's actually, maybe someone can comment if they know the answer to that.
Yeah, that'd be a very unique case for an attorney to fight there. Like, how do you, like, all the measurements are out there, all the pictures are out there, and someone hypothetically could just recreate it.
It's the mold too. It's the mold off the shedder rack that it basically allows you to recreate it. And it's an awesome legal question. I don't think anyone that has acquired a piece from the previous person that gave the rights away to someone to replicate, I don't think they told the person replicating to stop. Mm-hmm. I don't think so. I think they just keep replicating, and there's generally not a problem with it. Mm-hmm. But good question, good legal question as far as antlers are concerned.
Yeah, yeah. This is totally out of left field now, but if you had the opportunity to buy the Impala buck, would you buy it?
Also, one of the most divisive topics in the whitetail world.
That's what I got to ask you, right? Yeah.
You know, I think the best answer I can give you on that is I would want to see it. Uh-huh. And I would want to see it. And, you know, a lot of times if I buy a rack and there's some unknown entity, I usually have an earth magnet and a UV light. And that's actually come based on the recommendation of some people that know more than me.
So what do you check with that?
So a lot of times with the UV light, I'm looking for repairs without metal. A lot of times repairs have metal inside. And if it's just say a repair that has the material and no metal, you'll see that repair. The UV light makes it stick out like a sore thumb. Unfortunately, there's times where things are sold and they're not as advertised, if you will. And it's kind of your responsibility to make sure that you're getting what you think you're getting. The magnet, if you slide the magnet up and down the antler, if there's any metal inside, again, also part of repair or some other, maybe it could be a bunch of different things with what that could show you. It'll show you, though, if it's not original, it'll stick right to the antler. Mm.
When you buy something like this, do you have a contract you write up, or is it just a handshake and giving them a cashier's check?
Both ways. Mm-hmm. Both ways. I kind of feel like for historical meaning, it's really nice to have a contract, though, because years down the road to actually have like the date, you know, the bill of sale, the buyer and the seller, I think that's pretty cool. Like if someone had like the bill of sale for the hole in the horn, that's pretty neat, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think, you know, when you're in the heat of the moment, everyone's in a hurry. I think it's important when you acquire a piece from someone else. It doesn't matter if it's another collector or the hunter or finder. It's really neat to have your bill of sale. It's really neat to take some pictures of the two, if you can, the two parties and the piece. And it's really nice to have maybe a video if there's like a hunter, just a testimony of what the hunter has to say about it. I think the more you can do at that time, especially on good pieces, I think it adds to the history of that piece or just in whitetails in general.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. Well, I don't want to take any more of your time here. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I feel like I just scratched the surface of the world you live in. But is there anything else you want to share here, or anything else that you have going on? You know, maybe I have a 200-inch typical in my basement, and I'll call you in 40 years from now. But anything else?
Yeah, I was gonna say, just wait. It goes up in value every year. Anything else to share? No, I think the only thing I would say is anyone out there that hunts, and if you like antler, I'm not saying go out and buy something, but look it up, see what you think. In a way, we all like to collect things. Some people collect baseball cards. Some people collect sports cars. if you love hunting, not everyone, but a lot of guys love collecting antlers, whether it's sheds or racks. And I would invite people to look into it. They might like it more than they think they would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's great. It's cool that you're encouraging other people. I think like it's one of those things where it's kind of guarded, and that's maybe part of the mystique of it. But that's really cool, and I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing the story and everything you kind of learned in your journey here. And if someone wanted to find you, what's the best way to do that?
I'm on Facebook. My name's Jamie Martin under Facebook. And how else can they contact me? It's probably the best way to contact me. I'm more than happy to talk through their messenger, whatever it might be. Awesome. And Jake, I appreciate your time. It was really good talking to you, and maybe we'll do it again someday.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. And I look forward to following along the rest of your antler endeavors here.
Thanks, Jake. You too.